Today I will be making a tier list. I will be ranking all the Dota 2 items that are purchasable in the game. Lots of items to get through, 155 in all. But before we get started, a brief announcement. My Friday stream is getting moved forward. I'm going to start that stream at 3 p.m. CEST. So that should be more viewable for the Asian viewers. So my second largest country in terms of viewership is the Philippines. And for the Philippines, that means we're going to start at 9 p.m., which I think is fairly reasonable. Whereas with the old time, it would start at 1 a.m., which is a bit late. So the Monday stream is still going to be in the same time slot, 7 p.m. CEST, but on Friday it's at 3. So if you haven't already, go to twitch.tv/Jon Gunnarsson and follow me there. And of course, if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel and ring the bell for more up-to-date content on Dota 2, in particular around micro and zoo heroes. So without further ado, let's get into those items. So I have 7 tiers here, S through F, pretty standard stuff, and then I have another one, useless components, items that are only bought to turn them into another item. There are some items that also have utility on their own, that you might just buy at the start because they're efficient items, and then later eventually you're going to turn them into a finished item. We're going to rate these separately, but there's a bunch of items that you just only buy to turn them into other items, so they're going to be in this bottom category here. And then S tier items are items that are just unfair, items that are just far too good, and usually these items have some sort of drawback, like they're consumable items or they don't stack and so on. A is like really strong items that are currently probably a bit too strong. B is sort of the bulk of solid, regular items that are neither too good nor too weak. C tier items are more situational items that are maybe slightly on the weak side, but still pretty decent. D tier is items that are generally quite weak, maybe only good on a handful of heroes. And then F tier is items that are extremely niche, that are only good on a small handful of heroes, and even there, maybe a bit questionable. So let's start with the Abyssal Blade. This is a solid A tier item. It was nerfed a little bit, but it's still a very strong late game item, has a very good build up, and it's an item you want on basically every melee right clicker at some point. Then we have Eon Disc, which I think is a C tier item, possibly even D tier. It's kind of situational against particular heroes, like against Void, for example. If you're very being bursted with Chronosphere and others of burst heroes, it can be a decent item, but the cooldown is really long and it doesn't offer that much besides it's active. So I think it's a bit on the lower end of the power spectrum. Ether Lens also goes into C tier, but it's more the upper range of C tier. It's a pretty strong item on a couple of heroes, like a Shadow Shaman, for example, really appreciates an Ether Lens. But there's not that many heroes who buy this item, and it's nothing too crazy about this item. So I think in C tier, it is a fairly fair assessment. And then we have our first S tier item. Drum is actually a really strong item in this patch. It gives so many useful stats, like plus to all stats, mana regen, and movement speed is so powerful. These are stats that most cores want to have, has a really strong build-up. So this is an item that a lot of cores are buying this patch, and I think is still one of the most underrated items in this patch. So definitely try out Drum. Drum is so strong that you can even buy 2 of them, because all the stats stack, and then you get more charges, which is great. So Drum is a really, really powerful item, and I think barely makes it into S tier here. Let's for the moment abandon the alphabetical order and talk about all the different kinds of boots. So we'll start with the brown boots. This is an obvious S tier item. This is one of the best items in the game. It gives an insane amount of value for its cost. And the only reason this item isn't completely broken is that it doesn't stack with itself or with other boots upgrades. Because if they did, people would just buy various kinds of boots and stack the inventory that way. This item is just unfair, and there's a reason why virtually every hero in the game buys this item. Now what about the boots upgrades? First of all, we have arcane boots, and I would say that's an A tier item, probably like higher up in the A tier. This is a very solid boot, obviously gives you lots of mana sustain, helps your team out, and has a nice upgrade in Guardian Greaves. Also, you can disassemble it for some other items. For example, if you want to make a Soul Ring or a Lotus Orb. So Arcane Boot's really strong boot, but I think doesn't quite make it into the S tier. It just doesn't offer you any direct combat ability, it only gives you mana. Guardian Greaves, I feel, makes it into the B tier. It's a very solid item, obviously, but it's also quite expensive. And I think it just offers a fair amount of value for what it costs. So that's why it's in B tier. Base Boots, I think, is sort of comparable in value to Arcane Boots. Offers a huge amount of value, but it's not quite as strong as Power Treads, which goes up into S tier. I feel like that's the most solid, the strongest boots upgrade in the game right now. And any kind of right-clicker, this is sort of the premier boots. There's a few right-clickers who prefer phase boots, but generally Treads is the more general version. If you're in a sort of range hero, you almost always want to go for Treads over phase boots. And even on melee heroes, Treads just allows you to farm more efficiently with the attack speed it gives, and with that very efficient mechanic of tread switching. So Treads, I think, is an S tier item, and phase boots just below that, I think, in A tier. Armlet is in fact our first F tier item. This item is incredibly niche. Like, yes, Huskar buys this item, but like, who else? I don't know, like even CK doesn't really want to buy this item most of the time these days. So this is just a fairly weak item. It's incredibly niche. On Huskar, of course, it's still good, but other heroes probably should avoid this item. AC goes into B tier. Before it lost the 5 stats, it was a bit stronger. I would have maybe been an argument for A tier, but right now I think B tier is fine. It's like a fair item. It's an item you often have in the late game, but it's nothing particularly fancy. Skullbasher joins its big brother in A tier. It's a very solid item, gives you a lot for its costs. It's less than 3000 gold, gives you 50 damage on average if you're not a strength hero, and 60 damage if you are a strength hero. So it's even a decent damage item for its cost, and just a really efficient item. It's not just an item that turns into Abyssal Blade, it's also a very powerful item in its own right. Belt of Giant Strength is a perfect example of a useless component. No one buys a belt just for its value. You only buy belt if you want to turn it into another item immediately. So this is a perfect example of this category. B is for Battle Fury. It's just a solid farming item on any sort of melee hero. It speeds up with farming by a lot, offers you a good amount of regen. But of course there's other farming items. Sometimes you can't be as greedy, so it doesn't go any higher than B tier, but it's a very solid place right now. BKB is in A tier. It's just a very powerful item. Obviously there's a bunch of things to go through BKB, but in most games on cores you generally want to have a BKB at some point, and even supports often buy this item. So it's just one of the most spawned items in the mid and late game. Just really solid item, obviously. Blademan is another A tier item. With the recent changes where it has a passive, it's a very powerful item that sort of gets around the problem that the old Blademan has, that they can just ignore you for like the 4 or 5 seconds, and then they can just go back to attacking you. Whereas now, even if it's on cooldown, you still have at least 20% returned, as well as the 20 base damage, so it's actually a decent farming item even. And it's still very cheap, so this is a really efficient item, and an item you should buy on a lot of melee heroes. Some components here, and then we get to our Blightstone, which is actually a pretty efficient item, and I think actually goes into A tier. If you have the slot, this is a really efficient item. It's a good item to start with on a support, just to help out in lane, to trade better, combine your attacks with your carries to do a lot of extra bonus damage. It's great on particular heroes like Lone Druid, for example, always wants to have one of these. And as Lone Druid, even if you go for a Desolator, it's often good to just buy an extra Blightstone, just for some extra damage output. It's just really efficient item, only costs 300 gold. So that's, I think, why it belongs in the A tier. And then obviously it also has a bunch of upgrades. You can upgrade it to other strong items like Medallion and Desolator. B is for Blink Dagger. Blink Dagger is a very solid item that you want on many heroes, but it's been nerfed a little bit over the last 2 or 3 years. So in the past it probably would have gone into A tier, but nowadays there's a lot of heroes that were traditional blink buyers that are skipping this item now. Also, the existence of the new active for Abyssal Blade with the jump forward means that some heroes no longer need the Blink Dagger. So that's why it's now in B tier. You never buy Blitz Knuckles for its own sake. And then we have Bloodstone, which I think is a D tier item. It's kind of weak, it's strong on like a handful of heroes, and even on those you don't really want to rush the item. So I think D tier is pretty fair, it's sort of on the lower end of the power scale. Bloodthorn is a solid late game damage item, offers a bunch of utility with the silence and the true strike that it gives. So it's quite a strong item, but nothing overpowered because it is very expensive. Then we get to Bottle, which I'm gonna put into C tier, because nowadays most mids actually don't want to buy Bottle anymore. It's just an item that obviously offers a lot of sustain, but oftentimes it's a bit difficult to actually afford that 660 gold in the early game. For that same gold, you could have bought like a Wraith Band or Null Talisman or something like that, and had some gold left over to buy like a salve, and that just allows you to be stronger early on and often sort of snowball from that. So certainly there's still good heroes for Bottle, but I think in C tier is sort of where it fits, because oftentimes you're not really buying that many bottles. Bracer goes into B tier. I think it's a very fair item, offers you a good amount of value for its cost, but it's nothing spectacular. An item that does offer incredible efficiency is Branch. This is the most cost efficient item in the game, but obviously you're going to run out of slots quickly if you stack these branches. But there's such a strong early game item that I have no doubt that it belongs in the A tier. If you could stack these, obviously it would be the #1 S tier item. As it is, they're just A tier. They didn't build into as much as they used to, only into 1, which is of course another very strong item. So you can always just start with 2 branches, you have the slots, and then turn them into a wand. Or we'll start with 3 or 4 branches, eat 1 or 2 of them, and then make a wand. This is a very efficient early game item. Buckler goes into B tier. It's a pretty efficient item, no longer quite as good as it used to be, but it's still an item you can go for reasonably early, give you some nice efficiency to your team in fights, and allow you to help you to push. And then you can turn it later on into Vlads or Mech, so it's just a really efficient item. Butterfly goes into C tier. It's a little below the curve, I feel, right now. It got some nerfs a couple of patches back, and also the fact that MKB is very popular right now makes this, I think, a C tier item. Then we get to Clarity, which I think belongs into S tier. It's just such an efficient item. A lot of people in the lower ranks kind of misuse Clarity. They buy Clarity in the laning stage, and then after the laning stage they stop buying Clarity, which is pretty much exactly backwards. Clarities are not that great in laning stage, where you often take damage because there's a lot of interaction with your opponents, but later on in the game there's less interaction with opponents. So later on in the game is where Clarities are so strong. They help you a lot if you're in a sort of farming hero. So if you're, for example, playing Terrorblade, you should probably more or less always have a Clarity going when you're farming the jungle. But in laning stage, it gets cancelled so much that you would rather rely on Mangoes for the most part. But on the whole, just Clarity is such an efficient item that it easily belongs into S tier. Component, another component, but one that can sort of reasonably be used. Cloak offers a decent amount of value now that it's cheaper, only costs 450 gold. So sometimes you just see people buy this and then maybe even not upgrade it, or just upgrade it eventually. So this is a decent amount of value here, especially now that bracers no longer offer magic resistance. This shouldn't be here anymore, it's not an item anymore they can buy. Then we have Crimson Guard, which I'm gonna put into B tier. It's a very solid item, very strong item that is powerful in particular kinds of games. If you play against these kind of Sue heroes, you're playing heroes that attack very quickly, then Crimson Guard is strong, but it has some problems. It can be dispelled, and it doesn't work well in combination with cooldown reduction. So I think it doesn't quite make it into A tier. Component. I feel like Yules, is it B or C tier? I'm gonna put it in C tier. I think this item is a bit overbought. It offers a lot of value, obviously, but doesn't give you any sort of HP and doesn't increase damage output or anything like that. So it's just like a very defensive kind of item that offers a lot of mana regen. But I feel like it's slightly weaker than these kinds of items. Like if you want to buy a defensive item on a support, often it's better to just buy a Glimmer Cape, which also allows you to save teammates. So I feel like C tier is where this item belongs. This is an easy F tier. Dagon was already a very marginal item, and then in 727 they nerfed it, made it give so much less in stats. I don't know what they're doing with this item. It just really needs a buff at some point because it's just so niche. Like, who even buys this item? Like Tinker, okay, maybe Pugna, and any other heroes kind of very niche. Component, and I'm gonna put this into B tier. It's kind of far between B and C. It's kind of on the lower end of the B tier. It's a bit overshadowed by MKB in a lot of situations, but there of course are still some very strong Desolator heroes. So if you're playing TA, for example, you definitely want to have that Desolator. It's a really very efficient single target DPS item, but sometimes it gets overshadowed by some of the other DPS items. Diff was another one of these items that does hovers between B and C. I'm also going to put it into B tier. It was nerfed a bit a couple patches ago, and obviously it's very strong on particular kinds of heroes like on a Phantom Lancer or a Naga, but it's also a decent item on just regular agility right-click heroes, so I feel like it does belong to B tier. Dragon Lance was an item that was a bit underbought for a while, but now with the recent buffs, I feel like it actually goes into B tier. Another one of these items that are sort of between B and C. So I feel like Dragon Lance is a really efficient item on any sort of ranged right-click hero. Offers a lot of stats for its gold, so it can go here. Then we have Dust of Appearance, which I'm gonna put, is it S tier or A tier? Let's just put it into A tier for now. It's very strong against Invis, obviously, but the other anti-Invis items, so I feel like this is a bit less necessary than the other with S tier items. I'm gonna put it into A. Component, another pretty strong item. This is like a definitely solid B tier, maybe even verging towards A tier on a lot of these melee heroes. With the recent changes, this is actually a really efficient item. And now that it also has an upgrade, it's no longer a dead-end item. So this is definitely an item you want to watch out for. Mangoes go all the way to the top. That's just a really efficient item, not only giving you mana when you need it, but also offering a decent amount of HP regen, especially now that they're stacked. You have 3 mangoes in 1 slot. And that's actually a fairly efficient HP regen item, even if you don't end up using them for a while. And if you run out of slots, you can just put them into your backpack, and then when you need mana at some point, you can take them out and consume them. This is a great item. Component, E-Blade is kind of a niche item. If an item is really only good on Meepo and Morphling, it can't really go any higher than D tier. Verify is alright. I feel like it gets a bit overshadowed by the other early game items, but definitely Verify is not a bad item. Allows you to bait people in lane and offers a decent amount of value for its cost, obviously. But I feel like it's a bit overshadowed by items like a Branch and Mango. Salve, another great item. Salve is not just an item you want to have in the laning phase, it can also be a great item later on in the mid game, even the late game, when you're doing some sort of push. Often it can be good in the late game, just bring yourself out a couple of salves so that you can keep pushing after fight, don't have to return to base, because time is money, and just not pushing because you're running out of HP might just cost you the game, when just a few salves would have kept you healthy and pushing. In the past, 4-star might have made it to A tier, but nowadays, after a couple of nerfs, I think it's a solid B tier item, good utility item on supports as well as on some cores, and also has the upgrades so that it has some late game relevance. This is a pretty solid item and fits right into B tier. Another component here, and then we have Gem, which is just a really good item. If you're ahead in the game, you have map control, it's often just worth buying a Gem even if you don't really play against Invis heroes, just to be able to do D-ward. This item offers a lot of value against Invis heroes, obviously, so I think it's a solid B tier item. If it didn't drop on death, it would easily be S tier, but since it does, I can only give it B tier. Ghost Scepter is a strong defensive item, but it has no offensive capabilities and also makes you more vulnerable to magic damage. So that's, I think, why it only goes into C tier. Unlike Glimmer Cape, which is protection from magic, but also because of the Invis, it protects you against any sort of damage if your opponent doesn't have detection. So that's why it goes into A tier. Also has a really good build up. Whereas here with the Ghost Step, you just have to buy it outright. 1500 gold can be quite expensive for a poor support. Whereas this one comes in very efficient build up and the smaller items that are very good on their own. So Glimmer Cape, I think, is the premier defensive item for supports. Gloves of Haste is mostly a component, but sometimes you just see people buying 1 or 2 Gloves of Haste just as a value farming item. It's not that great, honestly, but it can be decent on a couple of heroes. Then we have Daedalus, which is just a solid late game DPS item. I'm gonna put it into C tier. It's another one of these items that are sort of between B and C. I'm gonna say it's a C tier item because it gets a bit overshadowed by the other DPS items. Midas is a solid B tier item. I think this item is a bit overrated. People are buying Midas a bit too much, but it's definitely a very strong item, especially on these kinds of heroes that excel with Midas, you know, your Arc Wardens, your Co-Ogres, and so on. But also in a broad variety of other heroes, this item is at least situationally viable. I think a B tier is a good spot. Casual headdress used to be all the rage, but nowadays it's kind of underwhelming. It doesn't give you as much value as you really need for that price category. So it's still more than just a component, but in general you only want to buy this if you really want to turn it into a bigger item soon. Heart is quite underwhelming currently. It just gets overshadowed by a lot of these other big stat items. It's just so defensive, doesn't give you any offensive capabilities. Like a little bit of strength if you're a strength hero, gives some damage, but it's just not that great of an item. It's situational on a couple of heroes, it's very good. So on a Phantom Lancer, for example, there's still a strong item on him, but even on Phantom Lancer, it's only a situational item. So I think this is only D tier. Heaven's Helper is incredibly strong right now. I think it goes straight into S tier. Offers so much value for its gold. Just the active is so strong, its particular heroes. I could see an argument for making it only A tier, but I feel like it's so strong right now that it does belong here into S tier with all the best items in the game. Components, Dominator, unfortunately, with the nerfs, only in D tier. Really breaks my heart. This is probably my favorite item in the game, but right now it's just very underwhelming. Holy Locket. Does this go into F tier? D tier? It's kind of in between. Let's drop it into F tier. It's just a really niche item, only really good on like a handful of heroes, and even on those, it's very much optional. So yeah, this item desperately needs some buffs, so it's just not that good. It got some nerfs, but Casual Hood is still like quite a strong item. I think it does make it into B tier, and then of course has the upgrade possibility into the Pipe. From Pipe to Pike, American Pike, I think, makes it into B tier, same as its components. These are pretty efficient items, and combining them into one is obviously also going to be good. This is quite an expensive item, but it gives you a little bit of everything, some stats, some mobility, some range. So it's a very solid item on ranged right clickers. Hyper's not really only a component. Raindrops, I think, make it into B tier. They're a pretty good item, but the problem that they get consumed is of course an issue, so they don't quite make it into the top tier of these consumables. So when they first came out, they were obviously S tier, obviously way too strong, but nowadays I think B tier is where they fit in. Metal Blade is a fairly efficient item. You can use it on more these right clicker kind of heroes, gives you a bunch of movement speed, and of course it's great in initiators. So there's a fair number of heroes who want to buy this item. I think it belongs in the B tier. Casual Javelin is just not very strong anymore. I feel like it's almost always a mistake to go for Casual Javelin on heroes like Pangolier or Windranger, but it's not a terrible item, so I'm going to put it into D tier. Kaya and Sanj, who even wants to buy this item? I like the stats are decent and so on, but I don't know. Almost no hero that actually wants to buy this item. To put it into F tier, it's not that bad actually, but it just gets overshadowed by, like, if you want to buy a Kaya and upgrade it, you probably want to buy Kaya and Yasha, because movement speed is just such a strong stat. So I don't know. I guess I'll put it in a D tier because Sanj is pretty good in itself, but yeah, it's sort of hovering in between here. Kaya is a decent item, but nothing too spectacular. Same can be said for Crystalis. By itself, it's like a decent DPS item, but like mostly you buy these two items for their upgrades. Casual Mobile Mask actually quite a strong item, good farming item. You actually see this on quite a number of heroes, so I feel like it can be put in the B tier here. Could also make an argument for C tier, but I'm going to drop it here. Lotus Orb, another B tier item, I think. Could also make an argument for C tier, but I think it's a decent item. Good amount of armor, a lot of mana. This is a solid item, and obviously not an every game kind of item, but it's a really good item to have on like a position 3 or 4 to just help out your cause, dispel stuff on yourself. This is a pretty solid item. How the mighty have fallen. Maelstrom used to be the premier right click item, but after a couple of nerfs, I think it only fits into C tier. It's just overshadowed by other sneaker items that are just more efficient in the current patch. Magic Stick and Magic Wand. These are S tier items. Pretty much every hero in the game wants to buy a stick or a wand. Pretty much the only time you don't want to buy a stick is if you're some sort of hero that does a lot of AFK farming and you don't want a stick in lane. If you're playing, let's say, anti-mage and you're laning against someone who doesn't use a lot of spells, then you don't want the stick in lane, and then you probably just skip the item entirely. But on like 95% of games, you want to buy either a stick or a wand. Manta style, I think, makes it all the way to A tier. It kind of depends on how good you are at actually using that Manta. So if you're not very good at Manta dodging and you're not very good at controlling illusions and so on, which is probably going to be the case for most people at lower levels, it's probably more like a B tier item. But I'm sort of assuming that, you know, people are playing well is sort of more in terms of high level Dota. I would put Manta into the A tier component, and then we have Mask of Madness. I think also makes it into B tier. Pretty efficient farming item, also good fighting item on a couple of heroes like on Lone Druid, Spirit Bear, for example. This is an item obviously that can be disassembled, so you can then turn it into Satanic, into Butterfly, a couple of other items. So this is a really efficient item and makes it into B tier. Medallion is an even more efficient item, makes it into A tier. This has a great build up. You have that very efficient Blightstone. You have the Sage's Mask. for some extra mana regen. So this is a great item on almost any support. Also a bunch of cores who want to buy this item. Like if you're playing Visage, for example, this is a pretty good item to go for. So Medallion, I think, just really efficient item right now, and it's so cheap. It's only 1,025 gold, I think. So this, I think, is one of the most underbought items in the game. Mech is a solid B tier item. It's pretty efficient for its cost, but of course costs a lot of mana, so you have to address that in your item build usually. But the fact that it combines with mana boots into Guiding Greaves is what makes this item very solid, so it's a solid B tier item. Meteor Hammer is no longer a meme tier item, it's no longer the meme hammer. It's, I think, a very solid item. Could even think about putting it into B tier, but I'm going to drop it into C tier here. So it's a very good farming item, as well as a reasonable fighting item on a couple of heroes like Treant Protector and Phoenix. But of course, if your opponents know what they're doing, they can dodge this fairly easily usually. So I think it's only C tier. Similarly to Maelstrom, Merlin has also been nerfed a couple of times. So I think it's a C tier item. It's maybe on the like a higher end of C tier, but still a C tier. MKB would have been an easy A tier item when 727 first came out, but now I think it's more like high end of B tier after a couple of nerfs. But this is still probably the #1 single target DPS item, and it's still in terms of cost effectiveness definitely competes with items like Desolator and Daedalus, even if you don't regard the evasion piercing. Moonshot is pretty solid, a bunch of attack speed for a reasonable cost. It's not just an item you buy to consume, also just a value item on certain heroes that want a lot of attack speed. So I feel like this goes into C tier, probably more like higher end of C tier, but C tier nonetheless. Okay, then we have Necro, and this is going to stand in for Necro 1, 2, and 3. Where they'll put this, probably like D tier. After the nerfs, it's just not an item that a lot of heroes want to buy. It's like Lycan, Beastmaster. Who else even buys this item these days? So yeah, I think D tier is right. And like, even those two heroes don't always buy the item. Nullifier is a decent late game DPS item with a very good active. However, if you use that active from range, the projectile is very slow, so people can often dodge this, avoid it in some other way. So I think that's why it only is in a C tier, kind of overshadowed a bit by other items like Abyssal Blade and Scythe of Vise. Null Talisman is actually going to A tier. It's a very efficient early game item, offers a lot of mana regen, and such great slot efficiency, so it makes it all the way into A tier. Octarine really benefits from the recent changes. Reduction in cost is a big deal. I still feel like it's a C tier item only because it's still quite expensive and still not that many heroes that want to buy this really. But it's definitely a decent late game option on a number of heroes. Movement speed is a huge deal in Dota, so slowing opponents is great, and any sort of melee hero that has problems with being kited is going to do well with an Overvenom. Problem with Overvenom though is that it doesn't turn into anything. It's a dead end item for 300 gold, so people are sort of limited in slots. There's lots of other efficient items that especially melee heroes want to buy, so oftentimes they don't really have the slots for an Overvenom. That's why it's only in B tier. But if you're any sort of hero that doesn't suffer too much from slots, so if you're a melee support, for example, this is a great item. Also on Lone Druid, it's a very efficient item, so definitely an item to watch out for, but unfortunately it doesn't get any higher here than D tier because it doesn't have upgrade options. Orchid is a very strong item after the recent changes that made it cheaper. So this is a very timing dependent item. Oftentimes opponents are racing to buy some item that's going to spell Orchid, you know, the Yules, the Mantas, and so on. So if you can get your Orchid earlier. That makes the item a lot stronger, which is why Orchid is now an A tier item. Perseverance is not a base item, but it's really only used as a component, so I'm just going to put it down here. And then Pipe, I think, goes all the way into A tier. Pipe is a very powerful item. You're almost always going to have a bunch of magic damage on the enemy team. So despite the nerfs, somewhat of an increase in cost, it's still incredibly powerful. And you probably want to have a Pipe on someone in most games. And just if we compare to Crimson Guard, I think it's justified to put it in the higher tier because it's just useful in more games, and also it can't be dispelled. You can buy two pipes on the same team and you're going to be fine. You can build cooldown reduction, you're going to be fine. So that's why I think Pipe is just a little bit higher up here than Crimson Guard. You sometimes see people buy Plate Mail as a value item, casual Plate Mail, but it's really mostly bought as a component, so I'm going to put it in a D tier here. Quelling Blade is obviously an S tier item. This is an incredibly efficient item on melee cores, obviously, but it's also an item you can buy on range cores because it still gives you 6 damage for last hitting. There's double of what the Slippers would give you. Slippers, of course, gives you other things, gives you attack speed, gives you armor, and also works against heroes and your own units. But it can't cut trees, which is a huge amount of value you get from Quelling Blade. Just the ability to cut trees alone might often be worth the 130 gold. So that allows you to cut through the jungle faster, allow you to create faster farming patterns. And also as a support, it can be quite good for warding and for cutting your way through the side lane trees to get to places where you're not supposed to be. So I feel like this is a really underbought item. Radiance is not in a very good spot right now. There's not really many heroes who want to go for Radiance. It's not a terrible item, but there's just a huge opportunity cost to go for this very expensive relic, 3,800 gold before you get anything done. And oftentimes it's just more efficient to buy a different farming kind of item. There's like something like a Battle Fury, or even just other items. You know, Drum is a good farming item, and also allows you to fight. Same for Mask of Madness, and then just go into a regular kind of single target damage item like an MKB or a Diffu Blade or a Desolator. These kind of items are often just more efficient than Radiance because it has come online earlier, and also the Illusion Hero is no longer as strong with Radiance, so Radiance has kind of fallen by the wayside, making it only a D tier item. Rapier is obviously a very situational item. You never sort of go into a game saying, I'm gonna buy Rapier, except maybe if you play Medusa, maybe that's your main plan, but most of the time it's only sort of a item you go if you're behind and you sort of need to take some sort of risk, or it's an item you buy in a specific situation to end the game. Say some of your opponents are buyback dead, you have 6,000 gold, might as well pick up a Rapier and just finish the game right there. So in some situations it's like an S tier item, in other situations it's really bad. Obviously it's a very high risk, high reward kind of play, but I think it's in a good spot in B tier. Component Refresher is, I think, not that powerful, just because most heroes don't really have the mana to refresh and cast everything twice, but on some heroes it's obviously a very strong item. I think that C tier fits this item well. Another component, I'm going to put Basilius into B tier. This item offers a very efficient mana regen aura for the laning phase, and then later on you can turn this into a Vlad's or into a Veil. So a very strong item to buy on a support. I'm going to put Ring of Regen actually into B tier. It's a pretty efficient item, offers you a lot of regen for its cost. Obviously you don't want to buy a Ring of Regen just as a casual item. You want to buy this to turn it into Battle Fury or some other item. but it's often an item that's great to buy in the laning stage to allow you to regen to your heart's content, and then later on eventually it's going to turn into like a battlefield or some other item. Ring of Protection used to be all the rage. Nowadays it's nerfed a little bit, so I'm just going to put it into C tier. Ring of Regen, similar to Ring of Health, also a very efficient item in the lane. So it's just very similar to this item, just a smaller version of the Ring of Health basically. Ring of Tarask also used to be all the rage, but after the nerfs, it's not that great anymore. You can still sort of buy this in the early game if you plan to like eventually make a hard, but I wouldn't buy it as a pure value item anymore. So I think C tier is where it fits. Component, and this 8 task is going to go into C tier. It's a reasonable item, but of course the fact that it can be dodged and dispelled is a big problem, meaning that Atos is no longer as good in the late game, but still has a very long range, offers decent stats, so I think it's a solid C tier item. Ancient Yasha is a very powerful item right now, and I'm going to put it into A tier. Just the status assistance and the increase in regen and lifesteal and so on is very powerful. So oftentimes on these kind of stats heavy heroes, you want to have a choice between Manta Style and Ancient Yasha. Both of them are very powerful alternatives. If you aren't very good at Manta dodging, you generally want to go for Ancient Yasha. And also in games where there's not a lot of important things to dispel, Ancient Yasha is generally preferable. Sange on its own is not that great. I'm going to put it into components. And then Satanic, I think, fits into B tier. It used to be A tier, but with the nerfs to its cost, I think it's more B tier material right now. Deadly Amulet is not just a component, it's also a very decent item on its own right, especially now that the cost has been reduced to 1000 gold. It's a very viable item to buy on a hero like Witch Doctor or Crystal Maiden. You can channel their ultimates, and your opponent's going to have to buy detection to stop you from doing that. That's a great way of forcing several heroes on the enemy team to buy detection. And also just the fact that it has no cooldown when you cast it on yourself and very low cooldown when you cast it on allies makes this item quite powerful for its cost. And then of course it turns into Glimmer Cape or into Shadow Blades, so it's not a dead end item either. Scythe of Ice goes into A tier, just a very powerful late game item that's good on almost any hero because everyone can use some detection. And yeah, it's a really solid item, and there's very little counterplay against this item. Shiva's Guard used to be one of the weaker items, but now with the recent buffs, I think it actually belongs into B tier. Kind of between B and C tier, but I'm going to put it into B because the new aura that reduces regen is very powerful, and just the ability to be able to buy Shiva's Guard and then also buy a Skadi. These two items together, probably not on the same hero, but like in two different heroes, just make these high regen heroes a lot more vulnerable. Silver Edge became more expensive, but also quite a bit stronger on melee heroes. On ranged heroes, this item is very bad, but on melee heroes, it's actually great, so I think B tier is a good spot for this. Already talked about Skadi. This item has been buffed a lot in recent patches, so now it fits into B tier. Used to be a bit underwhelming, but nowadays offers a lot of value for its gold, lots and lots of stats, and a slow that goes through BKB, and then of course that regen reduction that we talked about is a lot of value for an item that's not that expensive now. Components, S tier. This is an item that basically breaks the game. Smoke was sort of introduced to nerf Alliance's playstyle they had in TI3. This playstyle that just allowed them to control the map and just farm with all the heroes. This is no longer possible, at least not nearly as well, because of Smoke. It's an item that is so cheap and allows you to get so much done. Definitely an S tier item, and like there's a reason that there's only a limited amount of smokes, because if you could just buy smokes whenever you wanted, the game would just break. The item is so powerful. Sage's Mask was made a lot less expensive, but also the mana regen was reduced, so I think now it's more in the C tier. Could maybe argue for B tier, but I think it's like slightly weaker than the Ring of Regen on a lot of heroes. I'm gonna put it in the C tier, but it's like a C+. Solar Grass is quite underrated. I feel like this actually goes into A tier. Could make an argument for B tier, but I think A tier is quite good. It just allows you to offer so much value to your carry. You just buy this on a support, on an offlaner, and just spam this on your carry. Give them a huge amount of armor and attack speed and movement speed. This is just a great item with an excellent build-up. Soul Ring is, I think, C tier nowadays. It's like a decent item, but the change from regen to armor I feel like hurts this item for most heroes, because now it offers 0 HP sustain, and it's basically, if you want to use this item, you have to have a hero that either naturally has a lot of HP regen, or you need to buy some sort of HP regen item. So you can buy like a Soul Ring and Tranquil Boots. That's of course a great way of getting sustain, but it's also, it only gives sustain. It doesn't make you strong in fighting. So I feel like Soul Ring maybe previously would have been B tier, but now I think it's more like C tier. Linken's is a bit of a niche item. It was buffed recently, but I still think it's only D tier. You could make a case for C tier, maybe like D+. It is good in certain particular games, but often there's just much better items. Spirit Wrestle used to be extremely powerful when it was an aura. Nowadays, it's probably actually C tier or B tier. I'm going to put it in C tier. Because now there's a couple of alternatives. You can go for Skadi, you can go for Shiva's Guard, making the vessel just less important. Also the fact that it no longer gives movement speed or the aura makes it a bit weaker than the previous iterations. More components, and then we have Tango. This is the premier region item for the early game. Later on, of course, it's no longer as good as Salve, because of slot issues. You can still use Salves later on if you have them in a backpack. You can just switch them around, use a Salve, then switch back. But doing that for a Tango, it kind of isn't really worth it. So Tango is really only early game item, but they're so efficient in the early game that basically every hero has to buy Tangos or get Tangos shared to them if they're a mid laner. But even as a mid laner, often you want to buy more Tangos later on, especially now that you have a personal courier. Rebuying Tangos is great on all the lanes. ST is really all about sort of unfair items, and Tome of Knowledge is obviously unfair. There's just never a reason not to buy the Tome of Knowledge. Giving so much XP for so little gold is obviously a great deal, so you always want to use that. So it's kind of an S tier item. It's kind of like a gimme, like a freebie that you just get. Speaking of S tier, let's turn to the best item in the whole game, and that is TP Scroll. This item fundamentally changes how the game is played. Every hero needs TPs, and while Boots is an item that you can skip on like a handful of heroes, no hero wants to go without TP Scrolls. This is the best item in the game. Next, we have the remaining boots. Actually, I wanted to do this before, but I kind of forgot. I wanted to cover all the boots earlier on, but we're doing them now. So Tranquil Boots are, I think, actually not that great right now. So obviously it's still a good item, but just the fact that when it gets broken, it gives you nothing at all over the regular brown boots makes it, I feel like, the weakest of the boots upgrades. But of course, it's still very good on particular kinds of heroes. And then we have Boots of Travel, which I guess I'm going to put into A tier. It's just a very strong late game option, and also like a cool item on a couple of heroes. Like obviously Tinker is the prime example. Also a hero like Batrider, for example, really likes to go for Boots of Travel. But mostly it's an item that you go for in the late game. But it's just so powerful on so many heroes in the late game that I think I can justify putting it here into A tier. This is another component. Aghanims, obviously, it's such a situational item, depending so much on what hero you're playing. I guess I'm going to put it into B tier because many heroes want to buy the Aghanims, but many more don't. So I guess it's like a fair item. Depends entirely on the hero you're playing. Nearing the end now, we get to Urn. Urn is a very powerful item. I even considered putting this in S tier, but I think A tier is where it's at. This item offers a lot of efficient stats, gives +2 to all attributes, gives you 2 armor, gives you a good chunk of mana regen, and then of course the active. This is such an efficient item that I think you should always have one on your team. And you don't need to upgrade this to Vessel. This is perfectly fine, perfectly efficient item on its own. And then if the game calls for it, you can upgrade it to Vessel. Vanguard is a pretty solid item on its own. It's quite cheap nowadays and offers a lot of sustain and just resistance to early game damage, resistance to summons. So a lot of offlaners want to buy this item early on and then later on upgrade it probably into a Crimson Guard or possibly into a Abyssal Blade. But on its own, this item is also fairly efficient. Veil was changed to reduce its cost significantly, but also reduce the attribute bonus it gives. So I would say it's like a C tier item, probably like C+. This is pretty powerful on particular kinds of heroes. It amplifies all spell damage, so it's no longer just about magic damage. All spell damage is amplified. So this can be quite a powerful item. And yeah, I think it's C tier, upper level C tier is a good spot. Problem, of course, is it doesn't give you any sort of disable, doesn't really save you, anything like that. So oftentimes other items are more important. Vlad's is quite a strong aura item, offers a lot of value to your team. It's oftentimes an item you don't want to rush, but like having this in the mid game or the late game is quite powerful. You can just build this on any sort of support hero. As long as you have your core items, you can just go for this as like a second or third item. Also a viable item on a bunch of offlaners. And it gives a bunch of bonus damage and, more important, just a lot of sustain. This is primarily an item you want to buy if your team is already doing reasonably well. So it's a sustain item that allows your team to keep pushing, that allows your team to do Roshan and so on after you want to fight. It's not that great at actually winning those fights. So if your team's behind, this is not the highest priority item. Really just a component. This is also more of a component. I don't really see many people going this as a value item. Like maybe there's a hero or two where this is viable. Maybe I can put it into like D or F tier, but it's mostly just a component. Then we get to wards. These are obviously S tier. Like these are literally free. They allow you to give lots of map vision. Like there was once a Heroes of New Earth patch where you could buy unlimited wards, and that was the stupidest thing ever, because supports would just buy wards. That's what they did. They only bought wards, pretty much, except for like boots and stuff. Like this item is so incredibly powerful, and the fact that it's free just makes it even more powerful. So an easy ST item. But the counter to this ST item is this other ST item. So you have sentries, which of course can be used for dewarding. You get so much gold and experience from dewarding. Sentries are incredibly powerful. And it's a good thing that the sentries are limited, because otherwise a support would just be buying sentries non-stop at the higher levels. In lower level games, people just don't buy enough sentries. They don't really use the stock that's available. Often we see that there's 10 sentries in stock. That never happens in higher level games. In higher level games, sentries are constantly bought out because they're so powerful. You get so much gold back if you find a ward, and even if you don't, just the ability to just have this guaranteed vision in this area is very powerful. When you're pushing against any sort of invis hero with a Shadow Blade, always put on a sentry before you siege the tower, so you don't get any nasty surprises. Sentry Watch is just an incredibly powerful item, and there's a good reason why there's only a limited stock. Windlace is another S tier item. There's a bunch of level 10 talents that give you like 20 movement speed or 15 movement speed. So this is as good as a level 10 talent. There's also other level 10 talents that give you things like +5 to all stats, +4 to all stats, that sort of thing. So really this item it's by rights, it should cost something like 450 gold, which is a crown, which is +4 to all stats, or 500 gold, or something like that. Honestly, having 20 movement speed is about as good as having one of these stat items like a bracer or a wraith band. And if you have like a wraith band and a windlace in the inventory and you want to replace one of those items, honestly, you should give some consideration to replacing the wraith band, because movement speed is such a strong stat in Dota. Windlace doesn't stack with itself, but it stacks with its upgrade, so it stacks with drum, it stacks with Yules. Speaking of which, this is not a dead end item. If it were a dead end item, it would still be a really strong item, but it's not, so this item is just one of the broken items in Dota, and people are just not buying windlaces enough. Almost done now. 3 more items to go. We have Wraith Band. I'm going to put this into B tier along with Bracer. It's still a very solid stat item. It actually got better on a couple of heroes because generally 1.5 armor is better than 1 to all stats. But on the kind of heroes that really like to stack Wraith Bands, your Terrorblades, your Nagas, and so on, these heroes tend to have a lot of armor already, and they're Illu heroes, so they really want those stats. So in those heroes, Wraith Band got slightly worse, but it's still a very solid item that most Agi cores want to buy at least 1 or 2 of. And with all the armor it gives, it's now actually also a viable choice on some non-Agi heroes in some cases. Yasha and Kaya I'm going to put into B tier. It's maybe more like a B- kind of item, but it's pretty strong on particular kinds of heroes, your Leshrax and so on. This item is really good on, and it's a nice upgrade from that Kaya, making it not a dead-end item. So this is pretty good, and I think this deserves to be in B tier. Then Yasha on its own, I think it's like a C tier item. Sometimes you see these people, buy Yasha and then sort of hold off on upgrading it, and then like eventually they're gonna get a Manta or a Ancient Yasha or whatever. But before that, they might maybe want to have to buy a BKB or some other item that's more urgent. But generally speaking, this Yasha is not as efficient as Ancient Yasha. So if you want to buy a Yasha, you probably want to follow it up with a Ancient Yasha or a Manta style, which is why this Yasha only goes into C tier. So that's it. All the Dota items ranked into this neat tier list. This is, at least my opinion. If you have any disagreements, post them in the comment section. Are there any items that you would move higher or lower? Just let me know. And as always, if you haven't already, please subscribe and ring the bell. Follow me at twitch.tv/JonGunnarsson. I stream on Monday 7 PM and Friday 3 PM CEST. So you show up there, you can get your replays analyzed live on stream, and always willing, I'll see you there.